Well, I'm sorry that I managed to arrive just in the nick of time, but I hope you've all been having a splendid evening. I was learning about the work of the Indian music industry and this wonderful name of the Indian, what is it, Forum for Phonographic Industry? What's the F in IFPI? Federation. All right, there you are. Which is in keeping with a country that is governing its IT on the basis of the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885. So phonographic sounds almost modern by comparison. In any case, I'm delighted you rechristened yourself the IMI in 1994 and that you've been active in all the essential things that need to be done to protect the recorded music industry, which so many of us rely on and have relied on all our lives to give us musical entertainment. And I must say that you're right, my committee is the committee to which you'll have to address yourselves if you wish to see any changes in the laws. We're currently discussing a rather weak amendment to the Cinematographic Act, precisely because of concern about cinema piracy. And I'm sure there are related issues. My only concern with that one, as I made clear to the officials, was that they needed really to have a more comprehensive look at that act, which is woefully out of date. And indeed, on most issues now, the world has evolved in with such rapid speed that much of our regulatory framework, our legal system, needs to catch up, and we're behind. But I think Indians are very much on the cutting edge of many of these things, and they would really be the right people to try and do this. Now, you folks have asked me to speak about soft power, and it's a subject that I've probably spoken about too much and for too long. So if some of you already heard me on YouTube or whatever, forgive me for some repetition. But tying soft power into what you all do is, of course, why the topic is relevant. Because first of all, just to get definitions right, since the person who came up with this term, soft power, was an old friend of mine, Joseph Nye at Harvard. And Joseph Nye explained it very simply and clearly. We all know what power is. Power is the ability to get others to do what you want, right? That's the simplest definition of it. There are three ways you can do that. There are, if you like, inducements, carrots. You can give money, financial aid. There's sticks. You can threaten. You can use the hard power of your military muscle, your economic might. And then, aside from carrots and sticks, there is a third element, and that's what Joseph Nye calls soft power, which is the power to move people, to attract people to yourself, to your culture, to your way of life, and thereby to win their goodwill. So, if you have the ability to attract people through your cultural assets, your values, your foreign policies, then of course you can economize on the sticks and the carrots. And soft power, therefore, is both an alternative to hard power, which everyone understands, and in some ways a complement to it, because even countries with hard power feel the need to soften the edges of their hard power through soft power. So, Russia can march into Ukraine or annex Crimea, but the Bolshoi Ballet is what they'd like to show you when you come and visit Moscow. And that's part of trying to project the attractiveness of their culture. Or Beijing put on the Olympics and that wonderful grand opening ceremony. What a showcasing of soft power. But one of the challenges with soft power is, of course, that your hard power can sometimes also undermine it. So in the case of the Chinese back in 2008 at the Beijing Olympics, the attempt to project China as this wonderful soft power influence on the world would have worked very well, except for one fact. A whole lot of journalists came to cover the Olympics, and they began noticing the repression, the silencing of dissent, and so on in China, and they started writing about this. So the Chinese, in order to appease international opinion and all the negative press they were getting, announced that they would set up 7 locations around Beijing, where people could come and stand up and say anything they liked, including criticizing the government, complete free speech, sort of like Hyde Park Corner in England. 7 places around the city. There's only one catch. To be allowed to speak there, you needed to apply for permission. And you can imagine what happened. Every single person who applied was arrested. So it turned out that this seeming gesture actually was a shortcut to identifying any potential dissidents and troublemakers for the Olympics, and that, needless to say, did not exactly underscore or complement the soft power message of the opening ceremony. So soft power rests on principally three sources: your culture, which of course has got to be an attractive culture, it won't help you; your values, which means also your political values. Are you a democracy? Are you a tyranny? All of these things will work for you, and your foreign policies. Because if you have morally sustainable foreign policies, that'd be great. Now, the US, for example, is unparalleled in its soft power reach, because we all know that everything we use in the modern world, from Coke to jeans to McDonald's to Kentucky Fried Chicken to Microsoft Windows to Hollywood movies and Netflix and everything else emerges from America and American culture, and therefore there is very much this perception that America is the epitome of soft power in the world. But at the same time, using Microsoft Windows doesn't predispose you to extraordinary rendition, or enjoying a Coke doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be happy about Guantanamo Bay. And so the use of hard power, even by a democracy like the US, can undermine the perception of soft power. And that's the interesting element of all of this. The Chinese, for example, really have spent a lot of money and effort in promoting their soft power. They have these Confucius institutes around the world. There are over 500 or even 600 of them, often in very many university campuses. I think in the US alone, there are over 100 Confucius institutes. Then they have Confucius classrooms, 1,000 of them. They try and teach the Chinese language, and they try and promote, of course, a positive image of China. And this is something that is not entirely new, because the entire approach that the Chinese adopting goes back to the good old French, who were clobbered in 1870 in the war with Prussia. And they were even occupied by the Prussian soldiers, and Paris was never quite the same again. But when they bounced back, having suffered this humiliating military defeat, they realized that their best asset was indeed their culture. And so one of the first things they did on restoring their independence after the end of the Prussian occupation was to create the Alliance Française to promote French culture around the world. Now, everybody else has imitated them, so you've got the British Council and the Goethe Institute and all of these, and I can name a dozen more of that nature. And that's the overall idea, is that you can actually reach people in many attractive ways through your cultural products. Now, having said all of this, where does this come in to India? And I realize many of you are visiting India and perhaps are discovering it in some cases for the first time. One of India's greatest assets is, and I know it may not feel like that when you step through the haze that envelops Delhi right now, is actually its soft power. Because though it does have this enormous population, and it does have the world's third largest military, and in purchasing power terms, the world's third largest GDP as well, it is still, I think, most distinguished by the fact that it produces, through its culture, a number of things that actually appeal to the rest of the world. In the Indian cinema, for example, is an extraordinary calling card. I mean, an Indian cannot travel to Eastern Europe or even parts of China without encountering a taxi driver who will launch into a spirited, off-key and poorly accented rendition of a Hindi movie song, because these Bollywood movies have been shown in all these countries and remain very popular. Bollywood dance, for example, seems to be extremely popular on many American campuses. I remember my son was traveling in China with a Han Chinese companion, and of course, wherever he went in the mainland of China, or the main provinces of China, it was she who got all the attention, and he was treated disparagingly as this accompanying barbarian, until he got to Western China, to Xinjiang and the Uyghur country, where Bollywood reigned supreme. And there she was ignored, and he was hailed by everybody as Shah Rukh Khan. So this was the kind of image that Bollywood has taken India's consciousness of India to various people. And it's more serious than that, because Africans and Arabs, for example, in many ways our window to them is through this kind of soft power. I remember years ago meeting an African diplomat in New York who told me that his illiterate mother would take a bus every month from her village to the capital city, Dakar, just to watch a Hindi movie. Right? I mean, the dialogue is in Hindi, which she doesn't know. The subtitles are in French, which she can't read. But our films are made to be understood despite such handicaps. And she has a whale of a time watching all the singing and the dancing and the romancing and so on. And she goes back with stars in her eyes about India as a result. This is true in many parts of the Arab world. In the days of the late dictator of Syria, Hafiz al-Assad, it was said to me in all seriousness that the only portraits that were shown in Damascus that were as large as those of Hafiz al-Assad were portraits of Amitabh Bachchan, the then reigning Indian superstar. So these are the kinds of things that project India's image in other countries. Our television soap operas, which are spun off from Bollywood as well, have had a similar impact. I mean, for years at the peak of the Afghan crisis, when many Western countries had troops in Afghanistan, there was a raging war going on, India's biggest soft power asset was not the couple of $1 billion of our taxpayers' money that India was spending in Afghanistan, not even the biggest maternity and child hospital that's been built in Kabul, not even the fact that Kabul has 24/7 electricity because Indian engineers strung up the wires into the mountains. Not all of that. Its biggest asset was the fact that a television soap opera to which 92% of Afghan TVs were tuned happened to be from Bollywood. And for the Indians here, it was Kyonki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi. Now, this is a family drama full of all the melodrama and larger-than-life situations and characters that Bollywood's famous for. But it was one which absolutely captured the Americans. It was dealing with family issues. And those are traditionally in Islamic Afghanistan hidden behind the veil. So here was an opportunity to actually discuss family issues vicariously through the travails of this fictional family. And it became so popular. I read a Reuters story, not therefore an Indian journalist spouting chauvinist propaganda, but a British news agency from Afghanistan wrote about how the show was so popular that the religious leaders were complaining about the show, that it was reducing attendance at religious functions during its telecast. There were stories of weddings being interrupted so the guests could cluster around the TV set for half an hour and then return to the bride and groom. And there were stories even of crime going up during the telecast hours of the show. In fact, the Reuters story quoted an incident in Mazar-e-Sharif in which robbers had, because all the watchmen were busy watching the show rather than minding the store, robbers stripped a car of every single detachable part, you know, windshield wipers, side view mirrors, tires, hubcaps, you name it, and scrawled on the windshield in an allusion to the show's heroine, Tulsi Zindabad, long live Tulsi being the heroine of the show. So these are the kinds of things that we talk about when we talk about soft power. We can talk about yoga. India's persuaded the United Nations to adopt June 21st as the International Day of Yoga, and it's celebrated now around the world, and every year you see pictures from 100 capitals of large numbers of people, very many of them with no Indian connection at all, performing yoga in public places, and that obviously adds to the sort of civilizational image. The role of the Indian diaspora is no small thing, because they too have been able to change the perception in many ways of what India is all about. I remember when I first went to the US way back in 1975 as a graduate student, I found that the stereotyped image of Indians was, you know, snake charmers, fakirs lying on beds of nails, beggars sticking out, you know, a begging bowl from their skeletal bodies. And if you had to have a positive image, it would be a Maharaja sitting on a caparisoned elephant, right? None of which were particularly typical scenes in modern India, but that was very much the image. Today it's the opposite. Today you go anywhere and the assumption is that you're Indian, you must be a software geek or a computer wizard, because that's what India is now associated with in the popular imagination. And I remember encountering a sweaty European gentleman, extremely anxiously perspiring, at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam a few years ago. And he said to me, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? You know, I had to tell him I was a history major, but these are the things that happen. And then doctors in the West. I mean, it's a marvelous story, but about 10, 12 years ago, the #1 television hit in America was a show called ER, which stood for Emergency Room. So when they first ran the pilot of Emergency Room, it got good reviews for, I don't know, script and soundtrack and direction and editing and so on, and maybe the music as well. You would know more about that than me. But it was universally panned by the critics, who all said, 0 for realism. Who's ever heard of an emergency room in America without an Indian doctor? So they actually, after the pilot was broadcast, they had to go back and write in a major part for an Indian doctor, which was then played by the star of Bend It Like Beckham, Paraminder Nagra, who played a doctor, and the show then went on to be a #1 hit for many years. So there again, it's the way in which the image and perception of India and Indians has changed in recent years that constitutes soft power. Now, what about applying all of this to music? Obviously, Indian music is not as well known, say, as Indian food. Indian food is in a class by itself. I mean, there's practically no small town in the world now where you can't find an Indian restaurant or two. I didn't say it's a good one, but it is at least an Indian restaurant. And in the UK, they're ubiquitous. In fact, there are so many of these so-called Indian curry houses around in England that they employ more people. The Indian curry houses of the UK employ more people than the iron and steel, shipbuilding and coal mining industries combined. So the empire can strike back. In fact, the late Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, when asked what was the national dish of Britain, replied without batting an eyelid, chicken tikka masala. And in fact, he wasn't wrong, because what even many Indians don't know is that chicken tikka masala was an Indian dish invented in the UK. What happened was a bunch of drunken football hooligans walked into an Indian restaurant and ordered chicken tikka, which was promptly served to them. And these fellows looked up at this, chicken tikka is a dry dish, and very belligerently asked, where's the gravy? And seeing that they were large and very drunk, the restaurateur decided it was better not to argue and explain what chicken tikka was. So he took it back into the kitchen, opened a can of Campbell's tomato soup, poured it on the proceedings, tossed in some spices, heated up the mixture, brought it back, plonked it in front of these football hooligans and said, chicken tikka masala. But they loved it so much they kept ordering more. People on the adjoining tables wanted to know what these guys were having, and they ordered it. Word spread, and of course all the other Indian restaurants on the street were soon being asked for the same dish, and this is how chicken tikka masala was born. I kid you not. But again, can you imagine the sort of soft power elements of all of that? But even if Indian music isn't as ubiquitous as Indian food, it is pretty widespread, and there are many, many kinds of Indian music. There's our classical music, there's Bollywood music, and there's of course something that's neither quite one or the other, whether it's fusion, whether you call it any other term, which has been effectively circulating around the world. There have been movements in India like Spick McKay, which have promoted classical art forms and dance and music. There have been also other things. I don't know, probably no one in this room is old enough to remember the famous concert for Bangladesh back in 1971. There you are. And Ravi Shankar playing the sitar there. At that point, the ignorance about Indian music was so large that when he started tuning his instrument, he got a round of applause. People thought he just played some part of a raga. And he had to explain, sorry, I've just been tuning my sitar. Now starts the music. But he did get to play sitar music on the American consciousness. And it's not surprising. We all know, for example, how Live Aid in 1985 reached 1.5 billion television viewers and raised millions of dollars for the famine-stricken children of Ethiopia. And it's striking, after all, that it was organized by three musicians. One a lyricist, one who provided the melody, and the third who provided his voice. And of course, the single, which was marketed under the name Band-Aid, I recall, sold over 3 million copies. So you know that the idea that music can actually get a larger message across is widespread and understood. And in India, God knows, we could certainly use this sort of thing. We've had, for example, our challenges in our own neighborhood. One of the biggest, most passionate audiences for Indian music is across the border in Pakistan. But because of the various tensions between the two countries, these aren't things that can very easily, unfortunately, people can't easily move across, but music does. And it's very interesting, for example, that Coke Studio, the platform that has brought together classical performances, often televised live, and sometimes mixed or fused with modern music, has gained a colossal number of admirers. People say there are perhaps more people who watch or listen to the music on Coke Studio than drink Coke. And Coke Studio in both India and Pakistan have fans in the other country. And this is something that suggests that you have a tremendous amount of possibility for music to play a role in helping promote people-to-people relations and fostering a mutual sense of harmony and admiration, even without the backing of any official endeavors from the two countries. My friend Salman Ahmed, who is the lead guitarist for Junoon, his family hails from the Indian town of Patiala. And when he came over from Pakistan with his group and went to Patiala, not only was he overwhelmed enough, but he sort of sang a song on the spot in Patiala, the music video of which became a big hit in Pakistan. So you can see how music can contribute to promoting these relationships. Now, all of you are facing, of course, your own challenges. And you know more about them than I do, so I'm not going to pontificate. But I think one of the things that should give you all heart is precisely the point that your efforts, your music, and what you do to keep its quality high and accessible can move the world. People like to sing. They may not be terribly good at it sometimes, but they do sing. People like to hear other people sing. And that ultimately is part of what connects human beings to each other. There is, of course, music that is not sung, and that too is listened to and admired. But when we speak about soft power, we're speaking about what a particular form of culture can do to make a particular country attractive. I mean, no one can doubt the extraordinary influence of opera in raising the image of Italy, and to some degree of France. No one can doubt, of course, the significance of ballet in the perception of Russia around the world, and so on. And I think in India's case, it's still mainly through Bollywood that our music is getting out. But there are these other avenues that I've mentioned to you as well, whether classical or fusion. And with all of this, people who are not necessarily otherwise well disposed towards India, who may not be tempted to visit as you have been because perhaps they're put off by what they read or pictures they see, or the air they're obliged to breathe some months of the year here in Delhi. Despite all that, there would be a certain sense of, if not affection, at least liking for a country that produces music you enjoy listening to. That, I think, ultimately is where music and soft power intersect. Any country that wants to impress the world needs soft power. It's not the only thing it needs, because we all know that the bombers of 9/11 had their last meal in a McDonald's. It didn't make them any less willing to crash their planes into the World Trade Center. And we know that there are, unfortunately in our own experience, jihadist terrorists in our country whose last earthly act was watching a Bollywood movie before they came and blew up a movie theater. But the fact is that even though soft power isn't enough, it is an extremely important element of what makes a country strong, effective, and enables people to develop regard for it. And this is why I congratulate all of you in the music industry for what you do, for helping keep this indispensable asset of human culture and civilization alive. Thank you all. And I hope you have a wonderful evening.